Welcome to my video about MESSOR, the new compressor module by Cosmotronic. MESSOR is a versatile stereo compressor module with an internal and an external sidechain option and a switchable tube-like overdrive circuit. MESSOR has all the usual controls you'd expect with a compressor: attack, release, threshold, makeup gain and a ratio knob. MESSOR can do gentle compression, but it's also capable of limiting and beyond. It has several inputs to control the parameters with control voltages. Let's listen to some patches I made, and after that I'll go into a little bit of theory about how compressors work and how this is implemented on MESSOR. But first, I want to thank Cosmotronic for sponsoring this video.
स्वाधीनता सेनानी और सामाजिक कार्यकर्ता श्रीमती अरुणा आसफ अली को 1991 के लिए जानी मानी स्वाधीनता सेनानी और सामाजिक कार्यकर्ता श्रीमती अरुणा आसफ अली को 1991 के लिए जानी मानी स्वाधीनता सेनानी और सामाजिक कार्यकर्ता श्रीमती अरुणा आसफ अली को 1991 के लिए जानी मानी स्वाधीनता सेनानी और सामाजिक कार्यकर्ता श्रीमती अरुणा आसफ अली
To better understand how a compressor works, and in particular what the features and knobs on MESSOR do, let's have a short look at some maths and theory about compression. On almost every compressor, there's a ratio setting, and the ratio of 1 to 1 means that for every value, the input is the same as the output. So when there's a signal with an amplitude that increases with 2 dB, the output will also increase with 2 dB. And in this scenario, there is no compression. The X is the same as the Y. Now when we set the ratio to 2 to 1, this changes. When there's a signal with an amplitude that increases with 2 dB, the output will only increase by 1 dB. And in this scenario, there is compression. The top graph is still the same one. It's a scenario with no compression. Now the bottom graph is an example of what happens when there's a ratio of 1 to 2. In this case, if there's a signal with an amplitude increase of 1 dB, the output will increase with 2 dB. And in this case, we don't talk about compression. This is called expansion. Now the top graph is still the same, but in the bottom graph, I added some parameters. Now when we compare this graph to the one above, it's exactly the same below the threshold. So below the threshold, an increase of 2 dB will result in an increase of 2 dB at the output too. But whatever signal that exceeds the threshold is compressed in such a way that a signal with an increase of 1 dB at the input will only have an increase of half a dB at the output. The delta X is the increase at the input, and the delta Y is the increase of the signal at the output. Now when we have a ratio of infinite to 1, the line that was just a little bit tilted in the previous example is now flat. This means that the signal with an increase of volume of 1 dB or delta X will have an output with an increase of 0. So every signal that's louder than the 2 mark on this graph won't be louder at the output, and this is called limiting. Now in MESSOR, if you turn the ratio knob past infinity to 1 to the right, you get negative ratios. On some compressors, this means that you're expanding, but on MESSOR this means something else. In MESSOR this means that the line that was flat in the previous example about limiting bends down. This means that the signal with an increase in amplitude of 1 dB will actually have an output that's lower than the threshold. So in a way, this goes beyond limiting, but can still be called compression. Now at some settings and with some signals, when we adjust the makeup gain, this would actually result in expansion. Let's have a quick look at the front panel of MESSOR. On the top left, there's the ratio knob. With this knob, you choose how much the compressor clamps down whenever the threshold is exceeded. It goes from off or a 1 to 1 ratio to infinity to 1, which is limiting, and it goes into negative ratios, which, like I explained in the previous section, ducks the amplitude below the threshold. So this is the threshold knob. With this knob, together with the sidechain filter knob, you control from what volume the compressor starts clamping down. There's a bypass switch on the top right. It bypasses the compressor circuit, but even when in bypass mode, you can still use the harmonic overdrive of MESSOR. So when you flick the switch to the bottom, it's a pure sound. When you flick it into the up position, there's some harmonic tube-like compression added to the circuit. There's the attack and release times. With these knobs, you control how fast the compressor reacts. If you want the compressor to react really quickly, you turn the attack down. If you want the transients coming through, you turn it up. The attack goes from 1 millisecond, which is really quick, to 500 milliseconds. Setting the release really depends on what you want to achieve, and I will go into this a little deeper in the next segment, using some examples to show you what different settings sound like. Generally, when you turn it completely down, the compressor stops clamping down right after the transients, and when you turn it up, the compressor stops clamping down really gradually. The release times go from 5 milliseconds to 3.5 seconds. The sidechain filter knob is really useful. Most of the times I use this in the high pass mode. This knob sets what frequencies the compressor reacts to. I will explain this in more detail in the next segment. MESSOR is a stereo compressor, so there is a left and right input, and currently I have a VCO patched into the left input, and notice how the right output is going to my mixer. So whenever you patch one signal into the input, it is normalized to the left and the right outputs. But if you patch something in the left and something in the right, they come out of the according outputs. So you could, if you wanted, process two different sounds and use MESSOR as two mono compressors with shared settings, of course. There's a key input for the sidechain, or sidechain input as it's labeled here. This is where you can override the internal sidechain and use something else to trigger the compressor. More on that later. There's also a gain input, and whenever you patch something in this input, which only reacts to unipolar signals, the internal envelope follower doesn't regulate the gain anymore, so the compressor won't compress, but you can still use the envelope follower output to use another module to clamp down on your audio. You can even use this to modulate filters or pitches or whatever you want. There's an attack and release CV input, so you can control these with control voltages. There's also a CV input for the sidechain filter, and as I said, there's an envelope follower output, which is really handy if you're not used to using compressors to patch into a scope to look what's happening to your signal. It's really interesting that even when the compressor is in bypass mode, the envelope follower is still active. So everything in MESSOR is active even when it's in bypass mode. The only difference is that the envelope follower is not normalized to the gain anymore. So when you flick the switch up, it's normalized to the gain again. Now let's start compressing some things. Here I have an electronic drum beat. These are Lindrum samples coming from the NerdSec. You can see these as the top trace on Zeroscope. I've routed it through Paradigm for a little bit of saturation. And the output is going into channel 1 of the Cosmix. The drive is bypassed and I have the channel fader completely at the top, so a unity gain. The stereo output of Cosmix, these blue cables here, is going into the left and right inputs on MESSOR, and the output is going into my sound card for For the moment MESSOR is still in bypass, but let's engage the compressor circuit. The bottom trace here on gyroscope is the envelope follower output of MESSOR. You will see when I turn down the threshold, the envelope starts ducking, and it's this envelope that regulates an internal VCA controlling the amplitude of the output of MESSOR. Now usually for drums you don't want the attack to be too low or too short, because when you turn it completely down, the percussive transients get a little bit lost. So usually around 10 milliseconds or 30 is a good place to start. Now you can hear how the snap gets back into the drums as I turn the attack up. When you use a compressor to get a sound like this, you should set the release really low. This ensures that the compressor releases its clamping effect before the next drum hits. You'll notice as I turn the release up how the sound changes. At the moment we're compressing at an 8:1 ratio, but for gentle compression of drums, a little bit less is usually better. This knob over here is the filter of the sidechain. The way a VCA compressor like MESSOR works is that the incoming signal internally is split up into a sidechain and a carrier. Now quite possibly you heard the term sidechain compression before, describing the pumping effect in a lot of electronic music when the kick drum ducks away the bass. Now even when there's no kick drum or another source patched into the sidechain input, there's an internal sidechain which is just the signal coming in, and the internal envelope follower, which we're looking at the bottom trace of gyroscope, follows this sidechained signal. And on a lot of compressors there's a high pass filter for this sidechain. And on MESSOR there's not only a high pass filter, but you can flick this little switch and turn it into a low pass filter. Let me stop this beat for a moment. Now this filter, which is currently in high pass mode and at 300 Hz, at this setting filters out the low end, but the low end is only filtered out of the sidechain. Now the envelope follower, which is modulating the signal coming in, doesn't react to the frequencies below 300 Hz. So you want to use this whenever you don't want the compressor to react to very low frequencies. Alternatively, when you switch it to low pass mode, it filters out everything above the frequency you set it. So at this setting, the envelope follower won't follow any frequency above 300 Hz, so it will only react to the low frequencies, and the compressor will only clamp down when these frequencies exceed the threshold. Let me try to demonstrate this with another drum beat. This is from a live recording of a band from ages ago. The band doesn't exist anymore, but it was called Tuxedo, and these drums are from one of the songs they used in a national contest. Now this is just a loop coming from my computer, which is routed through a Mutable Music Things ears module to get it up to modular levels, and is going into channel 4 of my Cosmix. It's not going through Peradon. I turn down the high pass filter so MESSOR is reacting to the whole range of frequencies. And you'll see as I lower the threshold, the orange light starts flashing. And this is a sign that the internal envelope, which we're looking at, is reacting. And you can see on the scope how the compressor is mostly reacting to the kick drum and the snare. But at the moment there's still no compression because the ratio is 1:1 or off. So let me turn this up to about 4.1. And you can start hearing the compressor kicking in. Let me try some really exaggerated settings. And at these really exaggerated settings, you can clearly hear how the compressor is pumping. So this is without the compressor. And this is with the compressor. Now with the sidechain filter, you can control what frequencies MESSOR reacts to. So I turned it up to about 300 Hz. It's a high pass filter mode. And you can see how the compressor barely reacts to the kick drum. But you will see when the snare drum hits, it will react. The thing that always really confused me, particularly with software compressors, is that the sidechain filter only controls when the compressor reacts. When it compresses the complete signal. So you can set this up in such a way that the compressor doesn't react to low frequencies, but when it reacts, it will also compress those low frequencies, just as much as the high ones. You can see me adjusting the gain knob whenever I change the threshold. This is because there is no automatic makeup gain circuit inside MESSOR, so it's important to adjust this makeup gain manually so the levels at the output don't get too loud or too quiet. Now these settings are really good for controlling the overall amplitude of the drum beat and shaping the sound a little bit. But of course there are many ways to compress a drum. For example, you might want to exaggerate the transients, and for this you choose a moderate ratio. You let the attack where it was, around 10 or 30 milliseconds, and you turn up the release. But just be careful not to overdo it, so that when the next drum hits, the compressor has stopped clamping down. This way, the transients are exaggerated. So you might just want to do the reverse. You might want to duck the transients a little bit, but focus on the body of the drums. For that, you choose a really short attack and a medium short release. This is also a good way to completely squash your drums. And by fine-tuning the sidechain filter, I can choose from which frequency the compressor starts squashing things. Now let's listen what the compressor can do on a piano loop. I recorded this with the VST instrument, but there's a lot of dynamics in the chords. So you might want to control the dynamics of this piano recording a little bit. Let's engage the compressor. Let's turn the filter completely down. So the whole range of frequencies is triggering the envelope follower. Now for the moment let's turn the ratio up to 4:1. And I want to keep my attacks, I want to keep my transients. So let's turn the attack up a little bit, because the piano is a really percussive instrument, but it's not as percussive as a kick or a snare drum. And I want to keep it natural sounding, so let's turn up the release. So the compressor slowly stops clamping down as the piano tones fade out. There's a lot of low frequencies and body in this sound, but the transients are really more high frequencies. So let's turn up the high pass filter for the sidechain, so the compressor only reacts to those sharper transients, but it will also keep them in the signal because I turn the attack up a little bit. And the compressor isn't really reacting to the slower parts of the piano loop. It will only clamp down when the chords get louder. Now you can do some really drastic sound shaping with MESSOR. So when you're at the limiting setting, which is infinite to 1, there's no sound going above the threshold, so everything is kept at the volume of the threshold, and normally that's as far as you can go with a compressor. But with MESSOR you can go further. So when I turn this ratio knob completely to the right, it actually ducks the signal below the threshold. Now when I turn down my attack time and I turn up my release, and with certain signals, this might actually increase the dynamic range of the signal, so MESSOR will act more like an expander instead of a compressor. In de donkerste diepte onder de hooimijt heeft Wele, de moeder van Floer, haar nest gebouwd. De hooimijt ligt in het jachtgebied van...
For this example,
zich uitstrekt langs de
I recorded myself reading the first page of Floer het Fluwijn by Ernest Klaas.
En naar het zuiden toe,
It's a cool little book
het akkerland ligt hoger dan de beemden.
about a little critter and its adventures.
En warrige stengels als pezen door elkaar strengelen en er een ondoordringbare muur tussen veld en weide van maken. De hooimijt staat in de weide tegen de houtkant. Wele kent dit stuk van de wereld van end tot end, met zijn rijkdom aan voedsel, met zijn vijanden en gevaren.
So this is how it sounds without compression.
Tot aan zijn verste uitkanten heeft Wele het zomer en winter doorlopen en afgedraafd. Eerst achter haar,
Let's try a gentle setting.
toen deze op een schone dag uit haar leven verdween, alleen, gedreven door de honger, of vluchtend voor het mensdier. In de donkerste diepte onder de hooimijt heeft Wele, de moeder van Floer, haar nest gebouwd. Wele kent dit stuk van de wereld van end tot end.
And you'll notice when I turn up the ratio, I also have to adjust the threshold to ensure the level stays the same.
Verste uitkanten heeft Wele het zomer en
The bypass switch is really useful for this,
haar moeder en
because you don't need to pull out cables and reroute everything. You just can listen to the signal with
of vluchten
or without compression
in de donkerste
to adjust the gain and the other
de
parameters.
moeder van Floer haar nest gebouwd. De hooimijt ligt in het jachtgebied van Wele, dat zich uitstrekt langs de baan van Zichem naar Averbode, te noord- en oostkant begrensd door de beek die buigend door de beemden sliert, en naar het zuiden toe, achter het akkerland, door de steenweg op Oxlaar. Het akkerland ligt hoger dan de beemden, en tussen de twee staat de brede houtkant van Bramens sleedorens, van varens, brem, geitenblad
And if you want some of the transients coming through,
en warrig
it's best to adjust the attack to about 10 or 60 milliseconds, or something in between.
De hooimijt staat in de weide tegen de hout.
And it's best to adjust the release so it sounds natural, so not too fast,
Met zijn rijkdom
not too slow, somewhere in between.
en gevaren,
It's usually best.
schuilhoeken en geheimen. Tot aan zijn verste uitkanten heeft Wele het zomer en winter doorlopen en afgedraafd. Eerst achter haar moeder en, toen deze op een schone dag uit haar leven verdween, alleen, gedreven door de honger, of vluchtend voor het mensdier. Als pezen door
So if you're doing a mix
en er een
and you want your vocal to be
veld en weide
upfront,
maken.
you should turn the attack time somewhere around this.
Wele kent dit stuk van de wereld van end tot end.
But when you want a vocal that sits in the back of the mix a little bit more,
Schuilhoeken en geheim.
you should turn down the attack.
De verste uitkanten heeft Wele het zomer en winter doorlopen en afgedraafd. Eerst achter haar moeder en, toen deze op een schone dag uit haar leven verdween, alleen, gedreven door de honger, of vluchtend voor het mensdier.
Because of the tunable sidechain filter,
Van Bramens
you can also use MESSOR as a de-esser.
geitenblad en wilde hop, waarvan de vezelige ranken en warrige stengels als in de donkerste diepte onder de hooimijt heeft Wele, de moeder van Floer, haar nest gebouwd. De hooimijt ligt in het jachtgebied van Wele, dat zich uitstrekt langs de baan van Zichem naar Averbode, te noord- en oostkant begrensd door de beek die buigend door de beemden sliert, en naar het zuiden toe, achter het akkerland, door de steenweg op Oxlaar.
In this example, I wired up my precision bass through the mutable music thing's ears into MESSOR, and I tuned MESSOR in such a way that only the louder or sharper parts get compressed. The release is fairly long, and this adds a little bit of sustain to the bass. My slapping technique is really not good, certainly not on a precision bass, but I'll try to slap a groove and you'll hear how the compressor works to tame those transients and bring out the body of the sound. In this patch, there's a mix of two VCOs going through the MA35 filter, and it's patched straight into one of the inputs on MESSOR, and the output is going to my Cosmix. You can also see the output of MESSOR as the bottom trace. The top trace is the envelope follower. Now when I add a kick drum to this patch, and the bass and the kick drum are kind of fighting each other, there's too much going on in the low frequencies. And that's where sidechain compression using the kick drum as a key input to the compressor comes in. Please notice that even when MESSOR is in bypass mode, the envelope follower is still active. So currently there's no compression going on, but the envelope follower gives us a signal we can use for something else. In this patch I use the envelope follower output coming from the gyroscope to high pass some of the reverbs, but those are still muted at the moment. I think this is a good time to flick this little switch here. Right now it's in the pure setting, but when I flick it up it's in the harmonic setting, and a tube-like overdrive circuit will be engaged. There's a little bit of soft clipping going on. But you also lose some of the higher frequencies. Let's engage the sidechain compression. Now at the moment the ratio is at the infinity to 1 setting, but for sidechaining, if you really want it to sound extreme, it's really cool to turn it to the right. And you'll notice how it ducks a lot more when I turn it completely to the right. And of course you can shape the sidechain compression with the attack and the release knob. For sidechain compression it's best to set the attack rather low, but depending on the compressor you're using, it's best to not completely turn it down, because if you turn it down, sometimes there's a sharp click from the very start of the transient that's still getting through and being clamped down immediately after. So let's put it somewhere here. And the release time really depends on what the tempo of the music is and how you want the track to sound like. You can set this really short for a more subtle sidechain effect, and even though we're clamping down really hard, when you turn the release a little bit down, it's not so apparent, and even though it's not really apparent, it's still creating some space for the kick drum and the bass to live. You can turn it up so much that you lose all of the sound. So it's best to not overdo this. Now for electronic music, I like it a little bit longer, but for all other types of music generally, I would leave it a little bit lower. So without, with sidechain. We've come to the end of the video. I think I've told you everything I wanted to tell you. If I discover new or unique ways to use MESSOR in a patch, I'll be sure to upload it. I think any stereo compressor is a really useful tool to have in a modular system, not only to compress drums, but surely to sidechain basses. And I found in the short time I've been working with MESSOR, there's a use for it in almost every patch, be it shaping transients or ducking out the bass so there's room for the kick drum, for some gentle overdrive or gentle compression. It's really useful as a mix bus compressor for controlling the levels, so when you're performing live you could use this as a limiter so there's no harsh spikes going out into the PA system. I think the knobs on MESSOR are really sturdy. These big knobs especially feel really nice and they're really easy to turn. There's not a lot of torque, but there's still a little bit of resistance, so I think it's just perfect to have these kind of knobs for a compressor. I think MESSOR is really easy to dial in just right, and the fact that the sidechain filter has a high pass and a low pass setting make this so much more versatile. If there's any questions about MESSOR, please leave them in the comments. Cosmotronic released a phase distortion, overdrive and soft clipper module 2 called Paradam. I will upload a video about this module soon. I hope you enjoyed watching this video about the new compressor module by Cosmotronic called MESSOR, and I hope you learned something. Thanks for watching.